Well, hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. Welcome back to a new episode of The Sacred Speaks. Today is an interview with Michael Winkelman, and I'm going to introduce him, let you know of a couple of things happening with the podcast, and then we'll get started. So first of all, the credit here goes to the Sarah Costello and the Rutledge Companion to Ecstatic Experience in the Ancient World. This is one of the better books, and I'm making my way through it. I stumbled into Dr. Michael Winkelman through this book, and I'm very grateful for Sarah Costello for certainly kind of initiating my world, for putting this together along with Diana Stein and Karen Pullinger Foster. I hope I pronounced all those correctly. So thank you all for this wonderful work. Dr. Michael Winkelman, you'll see pictures of this book everywhere, but here is his first, the one that we really talked about, but then there's also this book, The Supernatural After the Neuro Turn. Check that out too. Great stuff. I guess updates before I introduce Dr. Michael Winkelman. 2 upcoming episodes. One I've already recorded is with Sean Manceau. This is his book, AP Psychedelics, Going Beyond Set and Setting to Achieve Visionary Virtuosity. And also a connection from when I was reading Dr. Michael Winkelman's work, Dr. Edward Beaver. His book is The Realities of Witchcraft and Popular Magic in Early Modern Europe, Culture, Cognition, and Everyday Life. And I will be talking to him. Really cool stuff. I just saw this back. What did witchcraft and magic in early modern Europe really involve? The Realities of Witchcraft and Popular Magic in Early Modern Europe explores the elements of reality in early modern witchcraft and popular magic through a detailed study of actual cases and broad-ranging interdisciplinary investigations of psychological influence on health, subliminal communication, perception, cognition, and transcultural aspects of shamanism. This is a cool thread that I'm on right now, and a lot is happening. Okay, with that said, don't want to keep you too long in the intro. I want to get straight to the interview, but I do want to read to you Dr. Winkelman's bio. Michael Winkelman, PhD from University of California, Irvine, and a master's in public health from University of Arizona. Retired from the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University in 2009. Winkelman has engaged in cross-cultural and interdisciplinary research on shamanism, psychedelics, and altered states of consciousness, focusing principally on the universal patterns of shamanism and identifying the associated biological bases. His publications on shamanism include Shamans, Priests, and Witches from 1992, which provides a cross-cultural examination of the nature of shamanism, and Shamanism, a biopsychosocial paradigm of consciousness and healing. Shamanism provides a biogenetic model of shamanism that explains the evolutionary origins of spiritual healing and ancient ritual capacities. This biogenetic approach is expanded in its assessment of the evolutionary origins of religion in his co-authored Supernatural as Natural. These approaches provide a framework for understanding the contribution of psychedelics to the evolution of the human mind and social relations and their continued application and healing. Winkelman served as an expert witness for the defense in the Santo Daime case against the U.S. federal government, which won their right of religious freedom to use for the use of ayahuasca as a sacrament. Winkelman received a Fulbright Fellowship for research on the health of ayahuasca church members in Brazil during 2009. Link below. And Winkelman is currently living near Parampollis in the Central Highlands of Brazil. Excuse me. He may be reached through his website, Michael Winkelman, MichaelWinkelman.com. And of course, look to the notes, the show notes, and there are some links to articles that we talked about. There's also a reference to Ligare, Ligare. Check both those out. Ligare is going to be showing up again in the podcast, fingers crossed. And for now, that's it for Dr. Michael Winkelman. Let me tip the hat a little bit. Of course, check out The Sacred Speaks at thesacredspeaks.com. New website is almost released. I realize I've been saying that for a long time, but quite frankly, this stuff takes a lot longer than anticipated. But the website's amazing. It's amazing. It really does provide the container that I envisioned, and I've had a lot of help from a fellow named Brandon Alcorn help, if not, dragging me along at times. Brandon's vision's been great, so thank you to him. Okay, as always, the Sacred Speaks is brought to you by the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. Check it out at thecenterforhas.com. It's a boutique integrative practice that my wife and I started many years ago. Check out the band Modern Nations at modernnationsmusic.com. As always, listen to the full song theme music for the podcast at the end of the episode. The song's called Clouds. And just for good measure, check out Young Houston, Jung, Houston.org. Jung Center in Houston, Texas is an amazing place to learn stuff like I'm teaching here. And then I think that's it. I don't really have anything else other than these few updates. Website's coming out. The series is coming out pretty soon. We're almost ready to release that. And thanks for being here. This is, as always, this is an amazing process. So thanks for checking it out, and I hope you enjoy the episode. For now, thank you to Dr. Michael Winkelman. Really appreciate your presence and you making the time, and of course writing this work and putting it out there for us all to learn from. Thank you very much. And for now, we'll leave it there. Dr. Michael Winkelman, I am here and grateful for your time and for the wisdom and knowledge that you've put into all this work. Your book here that we're talking about is we're going to be focusing on shamanism. It's a second edition work, a biopsychosocial paradigm of consciousness and healing. And this book was a wonderful read. It went into all kinds. I have a background in neuroscience and psychology, and so I really like evolutionary psychology. This hit on everything. So I'm very eager to pick at your mind a little bit. Thanks for making the time.
Well, thanks, John. I mean, I've had people tell me that you need a background in psychology, neuropsychology, and anthropology to understand it, but hopefully we'll make it more intelligible for everybody today.
Yeah, I get that. And you were speaking languages that I've had on the shelf for a little bit. And but it seems so relevant, what you're doing. So we talked earlier about structuring this a little bit by giving some of the physiology and the biology and going into social and psychological and spiritual dimensions of healing and healers that have existed. In your book, you quote that starting in the Byzantine area to today, you're looking at the nature of healing and healers cross-culturally, which is something I think that cannot be minimized as far as the importance is concerned. So I'm interested in your personal narrative, first of all, kind of what got you into this neurophenomenological perspective, as you call it, and what was the muse or the juice that got you in?
Oh, okay. I thought it was about my whole life trajectory.
You can go there too, man. That's great.
Well, I mean, I've more recently I've had people, ask me like, well, it used to be, why are you wasting your life, studying altered states of consciousness? Since then, it's sort of, well, why did you spend your whole career focusing on such esoteric topics? So it's kind of forced me into a reflection about, well, why did I seem, so drawn to these things and so obsessed with them? And I mean, I've had a lot of different kinds of experiences along my life that I would say, were extreme traumas. I may have been in Nazi military experiments on the Randolph Air Force Base in my second year of life. I certainly was smothered by accident when I was barely a year old. I drowned when I was 3 years old and had a life review experience. I had my head sewn up, 4 stitches, 10 points across here without any anesthesia when I was 4 years old. That last one just put me into some visionary space. I remember they literally had to drag me out of bed. I would get out of bed to eat and go back to bed. And I found visionary worlds that way. So, that kind of, early traumatic formation, I think, sort of disposed me to altered states of consciousness. As I got older, I was, very widely read. I read extensively as a child. I developed visual imagination. And then, my college years, psychedelics changed my major from, being a physics major to being a psychology and anthropology major. It sort of, took me into a domain that I thought was demanding. And some of that use sort of corresponded with a period of taking comparative religion and anthropology religion classes. And way back then, it was like obvious to me that, psychedelics had to be seen as a central feature of the evolution of shamanism and human religious impulses. So along the way, from these accidental traumas and altered states through the psychedelics, I think that I was sort of guided into a domain that I just felt compelled to try to make sense of in some terms other than these are just hallucinations. And so from my earliest experiences with psychedelics, I mean, I was going crossover to the medical school libraries trying to figure out what the heck's going on. Why do psychedelics produce these effects? How can we understand, traditional accounts of, visionary experiences in terms of the neurophysiology of, LSD or other psychedelics effects upon our brains. And so, for whatever reason from the beginning, I mean, I didn't view this as a spiritual path as much as I viewed it as a path of discovery, of trying to understand the scientific basis for traditional visionary experiences in shamanism and ultimately inspired religions. So along the way, I think some of the things that really, helped me see that, I read a book by Charles Laughlin and Eugene D'Aquili called Brain, Symbol, and Experience. And they lay out what is a neurophenomonological paradigm. Charlie and I differ a little bit on just how we should interpret neurophenomenology, but he sort of saw it as being a set of spiritual experiences that derive from the way our brains function. And I've kind of taken that more into a phenomenological experiential domain in which I try to understand the phenomenal nature of experiences, the structure of experiences in terms of how the brain operates, or increasingly, perhaps in terms of how brain systems are deafferentiated, taken offline. So, for instance, I think that we can explain a lot about mystical experiences simply in terms of certain brain systems being habituated or differentiated. They're taken offline. And so, we can have different kinds of experiences based upon what brain systems are left. And so along the way, I've just gotten a lot of different kinds of direct and indirect confirmatory, findings that show, yeah, a lot of what we attribute to mysticism and altered states of consciousness and shamanism and mediumship really can be understood in terms of some of the diverse ways in which our brain can function, or perhaps in some cases dysfunction. But I think rather than dysfunction, it's just not functioning. And that's why, for instance, we have experiences like the void experience of mysticism. I think it's very clear if you look at mystical accounts, they talk about, okay, you quit paying attention to the symptoms, you quit paying attention to your senses, you quit paying attention to emotions, you sort of retract all of these different aspects of the mind. And when they're no longer functioning, well, there's nothing left. There's your void.
Mm-hmm. I like your distinction here of introverted and extroverted mysticism. I appreciate that distinction because it situates, again, with cross-cultural analysis. I had a person I'm working with yesterday who was, because of the kind of Judeo-Christian system that she grew up in, she was looking, as often we do as Westerners, looking at Eastern philosophy, and the idea of non-attachment was interpreted as some kind of nihilism. And I kind of urged her not to take a Westerner's view of emptiness and nothingness, and because we so often do that. It's like devoid of meaning and then life. We go down a rabbit trail there. But yeah, I really appreciate that distinction. To go back in your history for a second, you said you were using psychedelics. What were you using when you were young?
Well, when I went to college, I mean, who knows for sure, right? LSD for a while, and then psilocybin more regularly, and then eventually San Pedro cactus, and then eventually ayahuasca, and along the way a number of different kinds of designer psychedelics. but mostly it was been, I'd say, psilocybin, ayahuasca, LSD.
Did you have a kind of religious practice around that then, or was it just jumping into chaos?
Well, I mean, for probably since the very beginning, I've had a meditative practice around psychedelics. I think I discovered personally, in my very first year of using them, that if you just went out and partied, I'd end up with a headache and exhaustion, and I
Mm-hmm.
somehow along the way discovered that if I meditated, that I had much clearer experiences and I felt a lot better afterwards. And that may be the roots of one of my anomalies as a psychonaut, and that is I really don't have visions. I don't have visual experiences. I had some early on. I mean, I understand things, I quote unquote, see things, but I don't have any kind of classic, psychedelic experiences when I use these substances for the most part. And exactly why it's not clear, but I wonder sometimes if it might have had to do with my Buddhist orientations early on, in which
Mm-hmm.
they argue, the visions are there on the path to enlightenment, but they're not the enlightenment, they're the
Right.
distraction. But for some reason, I don't hallucinate, and I'm also have a tendency to go into black voids and come back out with, nothing or virtually nothing, a one liner, about what
Mm-hmm.
happened in the last 20 minutes.
Well, so when you got into college, you have a little more um, process. You were exploring it academically. You were looking at how these anthropology, psychology, evolution, physiology may have some insight for what's happening when we take these substances. And you were certainly seeing it in our history amongst shaman. What did you were you working with a shaman? Did you get exposure to that? What was going on there?
Well, probably the only time that I would say that I really had contact with someone that, in my mind, would constitute a shaman was when I was in Huautla de Jimenez in Oaxaca. Went with a group of people from the Bay Area. We visited with Maria Sabina, and I did a session one of those nights with another local, Sabia, wise woman.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I mean, I really haven't had a shamanic formation. I spent a few years, doing some of the Horner methods kind of stuff, and we had a group of people who met regularly. Um, but my formation has been more, at the intellectual level. I would not present myself as a shaman, in
Right.
large part because I have a specific understanding of what it is. But also I don't practice what shamans practice for the most part, including I don't heal. So along the way, I've had a lot of intellectual influences, in part, the cross cultural understandings that you'll want to touch on a little
Yeah.
later.
Uh, so then to go back to something you said, you noted in the beginning of your book that you're walking this line between not wanting to reduce to materialistic presuppositions or to mental presuppositions in your metaphysical worldview. So you're saying that the neurophenomenological perspective is really kind of walking that line of the middle path and not making reductions, although anytime I think you get somebody in the religions uh, drawing the line between subjective experience and what they would call neural correlates of consciousness, there seems to be some kind of reduction. And so you did a good job navigating that territory, and I wonder if you just speak to that what you're seeing in kind of modern sciences, modern psychology, the ways in which we're relating to religion and spirituality and science. That's a lobbed ball I'm just throwing at you.
Well, I think that there's an important distinction between the phenomenology, what it is that you experience, and what's really there. And I think one useful metaphor is the rainbow. I mean, you and I can both agree that there's a rainbow over there, but the physicists will tell us there's not a rainbow there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that this phenomenal appearance has to do with properties of our visual system and light refraction, etc. So we have to distinguish between what we experience and what causes the experiences. And I think that that's part of my approach. And I think I make it a little more subtle, I like a metaphor from Gregory Bateson, in which he sort of compared the human brain mind system to a television set. And you can take apart the television set and never find the programming.
Right.
The television set is there as a medium for transmitting information. At the same time, how you tune your television set depends upon what you get. So I kind of see my approach as trying to understand what it is that we have to tune about the brain in order to get the signal. And I think that the idea that we get signals that come from places that other than the brain is well accepted, although it's normally thought that these are just through sensory mechanisms.
Yeah.
But I think that there are quasi-sensory, parasensory, extrasensory mechanisms that can also provide information for us. And so my approach has been to understand, how it is that the brain functions when we have these kinds of experiences. And, the neurophenomonological perspective tries to emphasize that there are aspects of the structure of the experiences that have to do with the systems of the brain that are operating or not operating. But once again, you can sort of reduce that to a receiver issue. It's once again how the receiver is functioning. Personally, when we come down to trying to understand this phenomenological experience of the spirit world, I am very neurologically oriented in the sense that I think that we are wired to experience spirits, and perhaps I'll elaborate upon that later. But I think the basic structure of our brain leads us to perceive spirits as sort of an extension of the basic structure of our brain for perceiving humans. So I take the phenomenological experiences as real. They are products of our brain plus something else. But when it comes to the ontological argument, what are they ultimately really representing? I'm not as sure. I spent some time, engaged in the field of parapsychology. And it's clear that, even people who firmly believed in what they call the survival hypothesis were not able to produce convincing results of the survival of an autonomous, willful entity after death. On the other hand, there's lots of, mediumistic studies done under relatively well-controlled conditions that lead us to the conclusion that there's something going on here. But I don't think that, we have to, assume that there are these autonomous human-like entities out there, doing things to produce the kinds of phenomena that we see in psychical research. So at the end of the day, I'm sort of a wavering agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not absolutely sure what's out there, but I'll also say that I probably wouldn't have made it to today if there hadn't been something out there helping me along the way.
So we could say that there's something there, but the way that we experience it may not match what is there.
Exactly. I mean, I think the human sensory apparatus is capable of processing somewhere between 1% to 5% of the information field that's available to science. We are very ineffective receivers. And if you have a pet, you know very well they respond to things that you don't perceive. And then they later you may figure out what it is. So, we're not very effective sensory processors, and we may rely upon a lot of information that gets transformed through other kinds of mediums into what we can then interpret it as a spiritual world. But I think it's also clear that much of what people experience as the spiritual world has to be understood as a product of not only their own experience and their own brain, but perhaps the brains and experiences of other people. I think that the whole notion of telepathically induced kinds of experiences have to be considered. I think we have to consider that possibility that clairvoyance may be reading somebody else's brain rather than your own in some cases. But I mean, that's not going to make the whole field any clearer when we begin to rely upon parapsychological explanations. But I think what they show to be the case has to be taken seriously, that our brains can, in fact, our brain mind produce external fields that can influence others.
Would you say more about that? So I'm holding on to this piece about what you said beyond our sensory system. And I want you to put some meat on that bone about what is our sensory system? Let's really kind of go slowly and like define this for people who may not may have only taken Neuropsych 101 or not. What is our sensory system, and then what are the limitations of that sensory system that predispose us to experience extrasensory experiences?
Well, I mean, typically our sensory systems are thought to begin primarily with the visual, which we rely upon mostly, the tactile, which we don't pay much attention to, the auditory, the olfactory, and the taste. I mean, then we can talk about senses of balance and things like this, but normally we think about the senses as this information coming into us from the external world. Of course, when we close our eyes and all of a sudden we have a whole range of visual kinds of experiences that can include somatic elements that don't apparently have a source in the external world. Mm-hmm. And in the context of psychedelic induced experiences, people would say, you can't tell me I'm making that up from memory. I never saw anything like that before. So how do we begin to explain these things? Well, we have a variety of innate intelligences that may provide certain kinds of explanations. But I think that we also have, a lot of different kinds of, physical stimuli, electromagnetic, infrared, ultraviolet, the list goes on. All these energies, they impact our body. We don't apparently have sensors for them, but they nonetheless impact our body. Well, how does our body come to deal with this? In different ways. And I think, one of the mechanisms through which we, put together this other kind of information system is through what's the most important information system that's normally available to us, the visual system. And what we know from various kinds of clinical studies is that the parts of the brain that operate when you open your eyes and look around in the world and pay attention to things, that's exactly the same visual system that's stimulated when you're on psychedelics. It's not like we have a different visual system for psychedelics than we do for perceiving reality. It's just that under psychedelic visionary experiences, our input is coming from somewhere else. And I think one of the interesting concepts to be brought into here is Jung's notion of the collective unconscious and the archetypes. Mm-hmm. This notion that we receive, visual constructions that represent some kind of inchoate understanding of something or some situation. And so that could be the mechanisms through which we come to acquire information that's beyond our 5 normal senses, that somehow our unconscious brain is capable of pulling together information and presenting it as images that we can then study and interpret.
And I think the important piece subjectively here, or I guess phenomenologically, is that those experiences are experienced as other.
Well, I mean, in a sense, yes, that's something presented to us. But I suppose a more mature contemplative may own them and realize that they come out of some of the inchoate structures of the brain mind, the unconscious.
Yeah, because you would have to have an orientation that makes space for that, or has a precondition that would lead you to invite that in a different way than just an utter rejection of even the possibility that we are a multiplicity.
Right.
So you mentioned earlier about the paranormal, and while that may be later in our conversation, I just want to plant these seeds also. This is the road you're traveling to get to the paranormal. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, personally, I don't normally think of myself as someone in pursuit of the paranormal. I mean, I suppose that, I should qualify that by saying, well, yeah, I do use psychedelics to get answers to questions. So, I mean, but that doesn't necessarily imply that I'm looking for a paranormal source of the information.
What if we call it supernatural?
Well, I'll sort of flip this, and I'll say that, when I first started studying transpersonal psychology, And the idea of transpersonal psychology is it's some aspect that goes beyond ourselves and beyond our personhood. And I was immediately led to the notion, no, this is our own innate unconscious potentials that we externalize.
Uh-huh.
So I think, perhaps rather than, the pursuit of some, paranormal phenomena, I'm more in pursuit of integrating the potentials that I already believe that my brain mind has.
Yeah, I guess you said it earlier. A person experiences something as real, and that brings up the notion of what is real. And this, I think, is where we get into a real split in the academy. Is that if we're going to define real by objective consensus, measurable, versus real as I'm having the experience of something, there are interesting distinctions that influence our religious orientation, our cultural orientations, our economic and political, and so on and so forth. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of naive materialism. I think that neuroscience, would firmly, reject any simplistic notion about perceiving an objective reality. Back to we only get 1 to 5% of the information that's out there anyway.
Right.
How can that be objective? And I mean, there's all kinds of confirmation biases and the construction of perception that happens through socialization. I think that we really don't have any basis to agree that there's a scientific basis for materialism. I mean, the very forms of evidence that we use for materialism are idealist forms of evidence. They're models created in our brain. I think that contemporary neuroscience is very clear. We see the models that we have learned.
Right.
What's out there may influence the models, but our perception is based upon models that are, in some sense, they're collective, mediated by language, created by cumulative experience, reflecting our own particular, biases and expectations. And that, on top of all the limited physical information we have all of these acquired biases that give us a model of reality. I like the term that Charles Laughlin used in his book on brain symbol experience, a cognized reality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we see. We have a cognition. All we ever see is the map. We don't ever see reality. Anybody that thinks we see reality is, too naive to recognize what neuroscience tells us about perception, which is to say, it's a highly limited, filtered construction.
So when you go at psychedelics, for example, and this may be too reductive, but do you imagine what you're seeing is a clearer understanding of reality out there, or a clearer, unfiltered version of reality in here, or both?
Well, I mean, I think that the psychedelics can help us get clearer understandings of what's out there,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know, um, in a lot of different ways. For instance, I mean, I think many people who have used psychedelics, start to experience all kinds of non-hallucinatory visual phenomena that have to do with the structure of the eye, as well as probably seeing, you know, micro, you know, agglomerations of material in the air. I mean, I think that there's lots of different visual phenomena that can be seen once you dishabituate the visual system. Um, so for instance, I mean, like a lot of times, we squint to get rid of the glare from lights, but I mean, that's just changing the information that's coming in. The glare is really there. There really is a diffuse visual signal out there, the light doesn't just stay on some, a cone coming out of the headlights of an oncoming car. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's all kinds of things that are out there that we try to get away from so that we don't, have this, more fuzzy reality. But reality is fuzzy. But I think that it can help us understand external reality. For instance, one time I was trying to figure out how to deal with a problem with my neighbor, and came to the very clear realization that he wasn't the problem; it was his wife. That's who I needed to deal with. So it helped me understand something external, interpersonal. When I don't have a lot of internal visual experiences, but when I do, I really feel like there's something that is a kind of, once again, a symbolic representation to be understood and deconstructed and you know understood in terms of its message, its content, which may not be apparent. I think that the internal experiences have to be viewed at a number of different levels, obviously, because people are highly variable in terms of what their experiences are. In my case, I've come to life changing decisions based upon things that I have understood while on psychedelics,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't necessarily see something as something visual. It was more, intuitions coming to a really concrete kind of sense of something I need to understand.
Well, and you spent a lot of time, if we're sticking with this kind of physiological landscape for a little bit, you spent a lot of time offering up definitions of and directions for exploring symbols and what a symbol is from the perspective of the neural structure. Could you speak about that? Because I really enjoyed your paleo or reptilian, paleo, mammalian, and mammalian distinctions of the brain, and maybe people don't know these. So I would love to hear
Yeah.
more about that.
Yeah. Well, first I'll say, it was a model that was originated by the neurologist Paul MacLean called the triune brain. And he proposed that, we had three relatively autonomous brain systems, an ancient reptilian brain primarily mediating, behavior and some basic, interpersonal dynamics, and then a mammalian brain that was really concerned with emotions and social relations, and then a neo-mammalian frontal brain, which was largely just a hard drive located on top of all these other things that served as an area to put various programs. I'll say, in defense of MacLean, people say, oh, well, MacLean was wrong. And then they'll point to some little thing about, an amphibian, or they'll point to something that a bird doesn't exactly fit in there. Well, we don't have a bird brain, although maybe the people that point to the bird brains do. But the notion is that I think, in spite of any, small and perhaps in some ways significant omissions from MacLean's model, it's clear we have a behavioral brain, an emotional brain, and more of a cognitive brain. And these kinds of brains function in some ways relatively autonomously. For instance, you can be driving to work for the 15,000th time, and all of a sudden you're there, and it's like, well, where was I the last 10 minutes? Well, you were thinking about something else.
Mm-hmm.
Your body took over, and it doesn't require the conscious thinking mind to keep on driving the car. A lot of times we're trying to focus on work, and our emotional problems keep coming up, and we keep thinking about our family dynamics or
Mm-hmm.
interpersonal
Mm-hmm.
relations or someone we're having conflict with, and we don't want to, but that's what the emotional brain wants to do, and it overrides what the frontal brain wants to do. So I think having this model of these three relatively independent brain systems then opens up a lot of territory for understanding the dynamics of healing, the effects of ritual, the roles of symbols, and ultimately leads us to a recognition that we require a more complex understanding of symbols than is part of contemporary philosophy and cognitive science. That our brains are capable of symbolizing at levels that preceded the verbal capacity by millions of years. I mean, we have been mimetic thinkers for at least 1.5 million years. We have been visual thinkers probably longer than that. We have other systems of information in which information can be presented to the conscious mind that doesn't involve language or spoken word. And I think a lot of the work of shamanism is happening at these, more inchoate, nonverbal levels, levels at which the interpersonal dynamic, the music, the dance, the drama, the enactment, the belief systems are all being compellingly integrated in ways that tell us something that we understand that's not manifested in the written word.
Yeah, it's like a bottom-up processor. So the symbol, you have an interesting way of relating to the symbol. Would you speak about what a symbol is and how we can kind of broaden our understanding of that?
Well, I'm not going to be real sophisticated here. I'm going to sort of go down to basic level. And Charles Laughlin, in his book about brain symbol experience, I think makes a compelling argument that all of human perception is at some level symbolic. That a symbol is something that stands for, provides information about something else. And the idea here is that even our basic understanding of what's around us in the world is largely a symbolically mediated process. I mean, when you open your eyes and look at what's in front of you, it's not this dark brown mass. It's a dresser drawer with some handles on it and a bunch of junk on top. I mean, we immediately take whatever is in perception as a system of designated items that have names and relationships. I think that what meditation tries to get us to do is to begin to suspend that automatic labeling system, suspending our prior, suspending the beliefs, suspending the network of words and concepts that mediates our relationship to reality. But I think in this very fundamental sense, we have to entertain that there are many different forms of symbols, and that the things that you see in dreams are symbols, and that the things that you see in the world around you are symbols, unless you're an advanced meditator or severely mentally incapacitated, no longer capable of imposing that symbolic network onto your perceptions of reality.
That's it. Those are interesting distinctions on the bookends here. Either truly affected from a physiological perspective or very enhanced as a meditator. That almost both of those things dislocate the typical modes of behavior for the brain, and that puts us in relationship with something mysterious that is mystical in nature.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the classic features of mystical experience is that it's ineffable.
Yeah.
Which, if you look at the dictionary definition, it means incapable of being expressed in words. I mean, that should be a really clear indication that the levels of the brain that are operating to produce those perceptions are inferior to those levels of the brain that produce verbal descriptions. That, in essence, a certain part of the brain has been taken offline.
You talk a lot about music in this space, music, ritual, and a kind of religious formation. And it's interesting because you're putting together, if I may, you're putting together art and different forms of expression like dance and song and chanting, maybe not so much chanting, but dance, music, as these precursors to language.
Certainly, they existed long before language emerged. What we can infer from the archaeological record is that the capacity for mimesis, behavioral imitation, was present in our species well over 1 million years ago. We know this because people basically made identical hand axes, use exactly the same processes for hundreds of thousands of years. They just basically imitatively copied what another person did it to perfection. So once we accept that, then we can try to expand upon this notion of mimesis, which is one of our innate intelligences, which is a suite of capabilities that include capacities for singing, chanting, emotional sound expressions, dance, enactment, dramatic expression of what we feel or have seen, etc. And so this capacity emerged, probably 1.5 million years ago as a social communication system that allowed, humans to, share information and to integrate their communities through the varied effects of these mimetic capacities. So I see this as really being a core aspect of shamanism. I think the evolution of the mimetic capacity is what clearly separated our shamanic precursors from whatever were the hominid rituals that existed before.
That there were these charismatic figures that kind of took up the mantle of leading these spaces. And we would call that, we say, relating with the unseen world. That these were figures. Sorry.
I mean, I don't necessarily, presume that their intention was to relate to the unseen world in the sense of spirits. They may have been really intending to relate to the unseen world, as in competing groups, marauding predators, felines that are checking your group out. Evolutionary anthropologists talk about, conspicuous displays, conspicuous manifestations, costly displays, behaviors that animals exhibit that call a lot of attention to themselves, but which serve as signaling devices that communicate both to members of one's own group, one's own excessive fitness, and simultaneously communicate to predators one's excessive fitness and awareness. So a good example would be, certain kind of desert rats that when they see a predator, they start jumping up and down, making a lot of noise, squeaking, but jumping up and down on their back legs, kind of dancing. You might say, if you see a predator, why would you call attention to yourself? Well, because as soon as a predator looks at you, first the predator sees, this person knows I'm here, this animal knows I'm here, they're looking at me, and they're showing excessive fitness. They're probably going to be able to get away before I could ever catch them, so I should look for something else. And of course, at the same time, the manifestation alerts one's own kin and group members that there's a predator present. So these conspicuous displays I see as being one of the cores of shamanism that was sort of a extension of what was the ritualization forms found among chimpanzees and other great apes.
Yeah, did you hear that? I tend to want to. I guess I'm a product of part of this religious orientation, which is something I want to talk about later. Is our kind of current religious orientation, which, after doing all this process, I realized that our current religious understanding is very current from the kind of currents of our history, and we tend to take literally these figures that we see. So there seems to be, and I want to try this out and see where we go, but there seems to be a point where we kind of got unhooked from a more animistic, nature-centered tradition, and the dualistic split happened. And that's, you made a really interesting, I'm going to fumble around for a second. You made a really interesting comment about evolution, and that sometimes, these are my words, sometimes evolutionary trails or roads aren't good. They're not necessarily good from I don't even know what that means necessarily, but I think you're saying like God's not always right. But let's talk about this a little bit, like evolution as it relates to the structures of our religious experience and institutions.
Well, I think the first thing we need to make clear is that evolution doesn't mean that things are getting better.
Right.
In some long-term trajectory. It's just what works right now. What's the best adaptation now that can be made based upon variation in the species? And what may be good at one point in time may not be good at a later point in time. So in that sense, we have a whole evolutionary history that was adaptive in the past that may not be adaptive now. For instance, a preference for sweets. When there was hardly any sweets around, wanting to gobble up all the sweets you could when you found them was a good strategy because they weren't going to be there tomorrow, And that led to these acquired preferences for sweets, probably based upon acquired preferences for the sweetness in mother's milk. But, this doesn't have the same overall effect when there's an unlimited amount of sugar available. So we have a problem of our evolutionary heritage that we have to overcome in terms of trying to make adaptations to new circumstances. And when we put this in the context of religion, I think that I can make a clear argument that the evolution of shamanism was the extension of capacities that were at least minimally present in our hominid ancestors and manifested in the kinds of things that chimpanzees do as group ritualizations. These are these collective nighttime encounters of the whole group that involve, conspicuous displays, and dancing and drumming and vocalizations. And those kinds of group protection and group integration processes, I think, were the platform from which shamanism emerged with the addition of the mimetic suite altered states of consciousness, effects of psychedelics. And that this functioned very well when societies were small scale. And the societies, for the most part, stayed small scale until the emergence of agriculture. With the emergence of agriculture, all of a sudden, you don't have to be wandering from place to place. You don't have to be optimizing your daily foraging paths by breaking into small groups. You don't have to be constantly aware of animals and whether they're threats or signs or signals of other things going on. And now in sedentary societies, a whole different dynamic emerges. And I would say that, the big shift there was from a set of practices that were designed to integrate our unconscious brain and mind through altered states, through ritual, typical of shamanism, to a new system in which the most important thing was tradition. And that tradition in agricultural societies, I think, began basically with agricultural traditions. How do you plant seeds? I mean, if you're relying upon nature and, water from nature, rainfall to plant seeds, your margin of error is very small. Plant your seeds, 2 weeks too early, they die in the ground. Plant them 2 or 3 weeks too late, they may get washed away by the heavy rains, rather than already have their roots set. So you need to have tradition to tell you how to do this. And if you look at pre-modern societies, you'll see that the primary functions of priests was managing the agricultural ritual. Now we get a little, distorted views of priests today because what most religious studies people look at are what we would call, monotheistic ecclesiastical religions that were an evolutionary form that emerged in complex societies with private property and a variety of other features of social dynamics that needed to be managed by a common God who could see everything and keep control of our behavior at some level. So the forms that religions have taken, we can say, has evolved. But is the modern form better than the shamanic form? Well, it's not a fair question. The modern form wouldn't have been useful in a shamanic culture, hunter-gatherer society. Conversely, I think the shamanic form has difficulties being effective as a social integrator because it's based upon a group of people that can get together and all relate to one another in a ritual context. I mean, there's, the drum only carries so far. There's only so many people that can crowd around the campfire. I think, modern raves may be an effort to recapture some of that essence, but notably, they've got amplified sound so that everybody can hear. Mm-hmm. So the form that religion takes, I think, has been something very related to the nature of society. And when hunting was the most important subsistence practice, then the most important form of religion was the animal-based shaman with animal identities and animal powers. We moved to agricultural societies, then it's our ancestors and their knowledge of tradition and how to do things that becomes more important. We come to more complex kind of chiefdoms. The ancestor system may persist, but now the ancestor gods become the gods of the whole society, and eventually it's a monotheistic system that appears to be objective, not tied to kinship or personal relations, and it's an objective system of rules that applies to everybody. So in that sense, we can see religious forms really as reflecting what it is that their ideology and practice enables the society to manage in terms of integrating a wide range of people.
For anybody that has their mind blown right now listening to that, this is one of the reasons why I've been looking forward to talking to you, Michael, that to see our trends. And the thing that I come up against here is it doesn't mean that the images or the symbols that are used by any tradition are false, not real, or unjustified, worthless. And I think that's what a lot of people are scared about, is that they've invested so much in a particular system that all of a sudden they've got to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I think what this perspective teaches us is that, no, I mean, really any system that you're in, the images and symbols point to something beyond what that system can possibly represent. So the problem then becomes when we take the images of any particular tradition literally and imagine that there and that human morality thing starts, and we start to say, well, this is right and you're wrong, and do some horrible things in the name of religion. But hearing this to me is expansive and opening, and it really provides an opportunity to dig deeper in any system that one might be in.
And well, I think one of the important things to use an interpretive framework for religious symbols and beliefs is that they are features that help the system function. And in that sense, they have a systemic truth in that they help the system maintain a certain kind of coherence. And they can be, right and moral for exactly those same reasons. It's the maintenance of society, as Durkheim would have put it. But clearly, when, social circumstances, ecological circumstances change, the ability of those symbols to maintain the system may be compromised. And, it's represented in the notion that, the demons and devils were the gods of old. One time,
or of those guys.
are the outgroup, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, in a sense, there's an interesting dynamic of religious evolution in that, in the shamanic context, there was beliefs that shamans were powerful in their societies, but that there were other groups thought they were even more powerful, and that the shamanic ritual dynamic was normally inclusive. Whoever could hear the drum could come, and it was mandatory everybody came from the local group. But then eventually we get to a level at which the integration of groups is sort of supplanted by the separation of groups. I mean, there was a long period of human evolutionary history in which the most important thing was maintaining relationships with other groups of people that weren't related to you to avoid genetic bottlenecks, inbreeding. And of course, these other groups were essential for survival in times of resource scarcity, famine, whatever. You had to have somebody else that you could call upon. And so, in that sense, the shamanic system was open and inclusive. But once we get to ancestor religions, where they're defined in terms of descendants from a common founder, all of a sudden they become exclusive organizations. You have to be a member of our kinship club to join. And when it gets to the level of chiefdoms, the same dynamic is basically operable in the sense that you have to join our system, but it's normally a kind of sort of patriotic us against them dynamic, which of course we see in the modern religions, the monotheistic religions. I mean, with few exceptions, they are not open and accepting of other religions. It's our way or you're going to hell. And so religions have moved from the system that was inclusively integrated into systems that were sort of in-group, out-group differentiations, and even in-group versus out-group morality. I mean, if you look at what religious systems often do, is like there's a certain set of rules for how you have to treat members of our community, but you can kill, rape, maim, and steal from people of other communities. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of the dynamic I think the world's caught in today, where we've taken what could arguably be considered one of the most important cultural inventions in human evolution, religion, and it's sort of stymied our effort to be more inclusive. It's creating boundaries between groups of people, which have certain advantages for the in-group dynamic, but it's dysfunctional when we look at it in the broader sense of the relationships between the group and the greater societal context. Because no social group lives in social isolation.
Yeah.
We're all inevitably intermeshed in these interdependent societies.
And not only that, we get crazy whenever we're isolated. When any individual constituent of a system behaves in really weird ways when it's isolated, from our babies to a blood cell.
Right. We're interdependent all the way up and down.
All the way up. So you said something really interesting about the maintenance of society, And I noticed that people look at that with contempt. There's like, oh, God was a manifestation of the need to control. And then of course there are agents out there that will take these dynamics and use them for their own, at times nefarious, sometimes unconscious purposes, gaining money, gaining power, gaining status. But then there are other people who are going to use these principles that are, as you're saying, neurologically, mentally structured in our consciousness as a way to bring about healing and connection and socially advantageous interactions. So we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I mean, we do need some way of maintaining society, because let's just run the experiment and see what happens, and it doesn't go very well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've seen a meme lately that was something to the effect, you know, if you need, a moral system to be a good person, you don't need morals, you need empathy. It's just,
Yeah.
and it's so. I guess that there's a sense in which, we no longer depend upon the law of God. We've got the law of the land.
Yeah.
But what is it that, the religious participation gives us? And I think, as you were just pointing out, the human sense of belonging is very important. And one of your questions was about, the emergence of religion and what Jane Goodall has to say. Well,
Yeah.
Barbara King, another primatologist, says, religion begins with a sense of belonging, our group consciousness, and our group well-being, our individual well-being as a function of group well-being. And we are the most dependent of all primates. We can't survive without a social system. We totally dependent upon the well-being of the collectivity for our individual personal well-being.
Yes. Yeah.
And in that sense, religion has been an effective tool under a variety of circumstances for providing that sense of well-being and for being able to, use symbols to exapt a variety of emotional dynamics related to submissiveness and bonding and the sense of well-being and psychoneuroimmunological responses and things like this. Is the real question is, what can we do today to maintain that kind of social dynamic when we live in societies in which we have such pluralism, divergent religions, and the inability to form effective communities. I've been reading a book by Robin Dunbar about how religion evolved, and he does a variety of contemporary analyses that suggest, I think religious groups, function pretty well up into about 150 to 250 members. Beyond that, a church or congregation has a lot of trouble maintaining coherence and stability if there's not some higher level political structure that keeps it functioning across time. That religion really may have evolved in order to ideally bond relatively small groups of people. So, that sort of suggests that maybe we, won't be able to find some universal religion. Maybe we won't be able to find some universal way of all of us coming together under the same blanket of belief. I have a hypothesis about how we might do that, but it takes us off into some pretty radical territory.
Well, I want to go there. Go there.
Well, if you look at religious traditions around the world, almost all of them have ancient and theogenic elements.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of very well researched documentation about the roles of entheogens and the Greeks.
Yep.
The spread of various cults from Eleusis to Mithras, during the Christian formative period. That there's, according to John Allegro, it was early Amanita cults that were the foundation of Christianity. And Jerry Brown has a book out about, psychedelic gospels, in which he shows the presence of psychedelic mushrooms in art and architecture and sculptures across hundreds, or more than 1,000 years. Turn to Buddhism. I mean, I think there's a good argument to be made that Buddhism has entheogenic roots. Mike Crowley has a book out about psychedelic Buddhism. I've written a few articles recently, book reviews about elements of psychedelics in Buddhism. Go to Hinduism. The so-called Hindu religion, which I think is kind of a constructed idea, but if you look at its roots, I mean, back to the early Brahmin practices, I mean, soma was the sacrament. And, many experts think soma was Amanita muscaria. That later was substituted when you no longer could get Amanita. And that eventually, by the period of Shiva, it was Psilocybe cubensis. Curiously, there are major temple structures in India that have mushrooms on the threshold. I'll send people out there. I have 2 articles that can be obtained through ResearchGate, but we've looked at, what could these be besides mushrooms? They don't represent any other kind of plant. Why are they on the thresholds leading to the sanctuaries of the temples of Khajuraho? And even more significantly, why is nobody talking about this?
Yeah, that's right.
But
Totally.
you go back into Judaism. I did a special issue of the Journal of Psychedelic Studies in 2019. We have like about a dozen articles in there that deal with entheogenic roots in religion. And Judaism has lots of very clear findings that they were using drugs, cannabis, probably other things that were more LSD-like, ergots. The manna was probably, some kind of psychoactive mushroom. I mean, just go from religion to religion to religion to religion. And if you want to look for the early evidence, psychedelics were there. This may be our path forward as a species in terms of religion. We can all have our own psychedelic religion, our own psychedelic mushroom cult. And that this will undoubtedly, promote a variety of different kinds of developmental trajectories. We have to recognize that just because you do mushrooms doesn't mean you become a good person. LSD doesn't necessarily make you spiritual. There's a lot of right-wing groups out there that bond over the use of LSD. But I think, what the studies at Johns Hopkins University have shown, that given the right set and setting, psilocybin reliably induces the most powerful spiritual experiences of people's lives in 80 or 90% of the cases.
Right.
I mean, there is an intrinsic capacity of psilocybin to induce mystical experiences, something which I would propose very few religious people have ever had. So if we want to buy into the argument that having mystical experiences are going to make us better people for ourselves, for our groups, for humanity, I mean, there's no better tool for doing that than psilocybin or similar, synthetic psychedelics. And this may, in fact, promote a major religious revolution. Tom Roberts says, the Reformation was nothing compared to what the psychedelic Reformation will bring. That this is going to enable us to have direct spiritual experiences, to experience God as we come to learn and know Him or her through our traditions, as well as something far beyond what our traditions have told us. And this may be the key to ultimately creating a more inclusive religious system on the planet, one that accepts and recognizes the importance of entheogens and recognizes that everybody may have their own path, symbols, practices to get there.
Would you go so far as to say that the dogma, orientation, perspective, practice of any particular religious institution is interdependent on the culture in which it was formed?
Well, it should go without saying, of course.
So what we can do deeper is to and that what I'm curious is hearing what this modern day understanding of religion, as we sit on the verge, and we're pretty far into it, but I just saw the other day that we've gone from 5 years where many people that are experts in the kind of FDA territory would say 5 years until psychedelic assisted therapies, but now it's 2 years. So we're on the verge of seeing radical transformation. But with that said, what does your expertise reveal to us about our current modern Western religious orientation and the culture in which we're in?
Well, I think it's back to what I said early on, the last thing the bishop wants to hear is that there's a saint in the parish. And I think that religions are very tied to their dogmatic top-down control. And, the church around the Catholic Church around the world has, gone through great efforts to try to, contain and restrain, popular Catholicism, pilgrimages, sacred spots, saints that heal, this kind of thing. It's hard for me to see how the major world religions are going to be able to, make a quick change to being in theogenic religions. But there's movements around. Ligare.com is now a consortium of Christian and Jewish, pastors, rabbis that are promoting the use of entheogens as tools for spiritual development.
How do you spell that?
ligare.org.
Org. Good. Look
And
below.
I mean, if you Google psychedelic chaplaincy, Google psychedelic religions. This is sprouting up around the place. But, will, the Pope endorse it? I wish, but, and on the other hand, it's still possible that entheogenic mushroom traditions are still present among the ecclesiastical elite of the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that, Hindus that pay any attention at all to their ancient religious traditions and the most wonderful thing of the past, Soma, don't ask questions about what it was and what it would be like to take it. It's hard for me. I mean, it's hard for me to accept that all of the entheogenic traditions of Catholicism were exterminated at the point of the sword, right. Although many were. I mean, there were villages of tens of thousands of people that were all put to the sword because there were presumably mushroom cults there in those villages. But the Catholic Church has been aware of the, entheogenic hypothesis, at least since Allegro's famous book, the Mushroom and the Cross. So that they would not look back into their own traditions and wonder about this, I don't know. But, when we look at the evolution of social forms and religions apparently became far more elite oriented in their practices and made the separation between the elites and the commoners that often corresponded to a distinction between esoteric traditions and exoteric traditions. So the sacraments and the real knowledge were kept for the elite and the masses were denied it. I mean, this was very clear in the case of the Vedas. The Soma was for the priest, not for commoners.
So we've got a Huxley-Leary split here.
In the sense that for everybody versus...
Yeah, for the intellectuals versus for everybody. Put it in the water supply.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to put a major dose in the water supply. I think there's too many people out there that wouldn't know how to deal with it. But, what is the appropriate context for this? I mean, we're having an interesting, ongoing discussion now with legalization of psychedelics in some states of the U.S., and the question is, how are these substances going to be managed? It's brought up the whole, concept of medicalization. I mean, is psilocybin something you should only be able to do under the supervision of a doctor? I mean, to me, that's turning the back on 5 million years of human history and prehistory in which we've been using these things constructively, for a lot of reasons. On the other hand, do you want your 7-year-old son to be able to go down and buy psilocybin mushrooms? Probably not, but, the question of when would be a good age for you to take your son on a psilocybin retreat is something we ought to be discussing.
Yeah, and that gets to the context. If you have a tradition in which you're a part and you're initiated and you have rites of passage and you are kind of brought into it, then that seems like a really healthy endeavor. But there are all kinds of ways that we don't. I think when it comes to taboos like sex and drugs, I think we do a real disservice to each other because in Texas, I've said this many times before, but there are 2 abstinence-only counties in Texas, in North Texas, in the Panhandle area, and they have the highest per capita rates of teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. And that in and of itself should be a signal, like an alarm bell for our resistances and our kind of blind abstinence-only policies with these taboos, right? That scare the shit out of everybody.
Must be the devil.
Must be some demon somewhere. Yes, absolutely. Well, and just as a funny point of note, I've read a lot of several. I've read several of these Inquisition papers from priests, and I mean the devil came from their psyches. That's what's so fascinating that we tend not to recognize, is that when they're looking at these women doing weird rituals in the moonlight and people taking mushrooms and talking to God, and that doesn't match, they project demon worship or devil worship onto these folks. And then we get planted in our cultural ethos that those kinds of processes related to the body and pleasure and alternate states of consciousness are somehow demonic. And we're still living out that mimetic, if you will, that corrupts our perception of nature and reality.
Well, let me just throw out something here. Back to this Khajuraho, the Kama Sutra temples. I mean, one of the other anomalies, besides that they've got these mushrooms on the thresholds to the sanctuaries, is that they've got these sculptures of naked women in sexual poses, engaging in sexual acts. We actually tried to put the title of that section of the paper, Sex and Drugs in Khajuraho, but the editor wouldn't accept it.
See, look at that, right? You were censored, man.
But it's a very interesting phenomenon that, they've got these anomalistic temples that, can't be Brahmin, even though the Brahmins want to claim them, because they got all these women in sexual postures and positions, and they got the mushrooms. Are these two things linked? Is there a reason why they are both on these anomalistic temples? So I encourage your listeners to go look. I got two papers there on ResearchGate about, the Kama Sutra temples and, the entheomycology of India.
Yeah, and apparently there's a lot of literature on how the body was the apothecary, how sexual fluids and the body and alternate states of consciousness were all kind of melded together in these temples. So there's all kinds of threads and territories that people can get into there. But at least what we can understand is that there have been core instinctual urges that somehow were corrupted along the line, with entire mythologies and narratives written around this separation of what is natural and what is amoral or unnatural. And that traditions are built around these value systems and perpetuate that belief system, and then will kick you out of it if you don't align with that belief system. And therein lies I think there's a core religious nature of our psyche, but there's also a nature of institutions that at some point unhook. I think your comment earlier was really appreciated. Unhook from the original symbolic nature of that tradition, and then it becomes a kind of stale dogma that's just reifying itself over and over again. While we're on this thread, I think we should open up the conversation about Western medicine and religion and what that concept really means, because I think that you could probably include the same kind of lens at what Western medicine is. So what does that stir up for you? Western medicine, Western religion?
Well, I mean, if you go back to Descartes, he made the deal to, separate the study of the humans and their body from issues about, soul and spiritual matters. If we take the soul and spiritual matters to primarily be concerned with our psychology and emotions and unconscious dynamics, I mean, we threw out a major aspect of what it means to be a human being in the definition of science and consequently medicine. And I think that, that is, still part of the problem of Western medicine. I think that most people have a deep misunderstanding about what Western medicine or biomedicine is really intended to do. And people think, well, they prove this medicine makes me better. No. The FDA does not require that any trials done on drugs show that there's actually going to be an improvement in the health of the patient. The only thing you have to do is show that a drug reduces a symptom. So if you think that high cholesterol causes cardiovascular disease, if you come up with a drug that reduces cholesterol, then it's approved, like the statin drugs, like Lipitor. But what happens when you take Lipitor? Your risk of a cardiovascular event increases. You're more likely to die of a heart attack from the very drug that's supposed to prevent you from that. How can that be the case? Because they never tested the drugs on whether or not they healed people, made them better. They only have to show that that reduces a symptom. And so we have symptomatic medicine. It's also referred to as allopathic medicine. You act against the symptoms. So you got diarrhea. There's a medicine to take to stop your diarrhea. It'll probably make you very sick, because if you got diarrhea, you're trying to get the shit out for a good reason. Now, if you're getting ready to get on an airplane, okay, maybe you want to take it.
Right.
But, if you don't keep on having diarrhea to expel all those toxins, you're going to get worse and worse. But that, to me, sort of typifies Western medicine. They're trying to bottle up the shit rather than get rid of it. And so, if we look at Western medicine from this point of view, it makes it very clear that they're not in the interest of health. And if you look at the meaning of medicine, it's to manage something. It's not to have anything to do with curing or healing. Healing got thrown out with Descartes', agreement with the church. And, today our so-called healing traditions are basically run by pharmaceutical companies. Almost all post-medical school education that a physician will receive is going to be funded by a pharmaceutical company that may even pay the physician to go spend, a week in the Caribbean listening to lectures about all the off-label uses of the drugs that the pharmaceutical company wants to encourage physicians to do. So we do not have a healing tradition based upon healing. We have a healing tradition that appropriates the term, but it's really just concerned with suppressing symptoms and making money. And I think that, the notion that contemporary medicine just ought to be referred to as capitalist medicine can really help us understand what's really going on here. It's not about people getting better. It's about clients that will continue to return because you got rid of the symptoms, but you didn't get rid of the causes. And in the meantime, you probably created 3 more symptoms as side effects of the drug that you now need treatment for. So, in my, view is that what we call medicine today doesn't deserve to be called anything related to healing. There's very little in Western medicine today that's really focused upon healing the body and nothing on healing the soul.
And speak about the importance of that soul, because that seems like a foreign concept to many people in a materialistic Western tradition.
Well, what is the soul? If you look at the cross-cultural research, every society and culture has this notion of, some aspect to our total being that inhabits the body but is not the body. Mm-hmm. That may be disconnected from the body, perhaps permanently at death, but that has these implicit kinds of qualities that are normally related to the notion of our connection with others, connection with spirit beings, connection with some broader system of belief. And I would like to propose that what we do is begin to understand these aspects that people everywhere sense and experience and find importance in, is really reflecting aspects of our evolved psychology and of our unconscious psychodynamics. Once again, you may want to reduce, call that a reduction or reductionism. But I think that even if you want to have a strictly spiritual interpretation of souls and spirits, you are obliged to understand how they are manifested through our bodies.
Yeah.
Okay. And so maybe it's, you just, what you view as my, reductionistic approach is really just trying to talk about the template through which the spiritual manifests itself. But understanding the template's important. Just like if you want to know why your TV's not getting the channel you want to watch, you have to understand about how your TV is tuned. and what channels are available to it and what you need to do in order to get other channels. So I find the television metaphor really appropriate for talking about the human brain. It's an essential part of the message, but it's not the source of the message in all cases.
And that's what we call soul, is those things that are outside of our typical modes of understanding, the animator.
Sure.
So you're kind of talking through healing, and if the Western kind of capitalistic medical tradition is leaving out soul, and you're doing a cross-cultural analysis of healers since the Byzantine era, what's your critique? Who are healers? What kind of sources do they need to pull from, and how do they heal?
Well, I think from the beginning, healing had at least two major dimensions. Three, if we want to include midwifery, but I'll leave that out for the moment. One is that source natural products, herbs. Shamans used herbs. They were often considered to be the experts, although there normally were other herbal experts who weren't shamans. And when you look through most of the history of healing practices, people were using herbs. So the whole tradition of spiritual healing is deeply steeped in phytopharmacology. And in many cases, they saw each plant as having its own spirit that brought the qualities that treated the diseases that they were used for. The other part of the healing tradition, I think, is the ritual dynamic. And ritual is a kind of a problematic and slippery term, because today, it's just a ritual, it's a deep discounting of the notion that there's anything efficacious. But I think that there are a variety of forms of our evolved consciousness that are very susceptible to ritual influences. And it may be that you need to enter into a context of belief. You may need to be with a community of believers. You may need to have a kind of altered state dynamic to reduce your ego boundaries and to enhance access to the paleo-mammalian and reptilian brain. But the idea is here that across time, ritual has been an important aspect of healing. And rather than discounting the ritual, I think we need to embrace the ritual, just as today, we have to understand what's placebo effect and what's, pharmacological effect. And it's actually a very problematic phenomena, because you may have noticed recently a number of studies evaluating the effectiveness of psilocybin in the treatment of a condition. The results got washed out because the placebo group also got better. So the placebo is not, we have a misunderstanding of placebo, I think. Most of the time, that's just a placebo, as if you just think you're getting better. But no, what a placebo effect means is that you were given an inert substance, but the context of administration, read the ritual here, produced some improvement. Your hope, your expectation, the interpersonal interaction, the dynamics of the setting, whatever. So placebo effects are a core part of the healing response. And I think that this needs to be, recognized as a significant aspect of healing that has gone back across all of these different spiritual healing traditions. That placebo is a healing effect that they were very good at marshaling. We also have a range of endorphin effects. What a number of studies have established is that rhythmic movement, dance, close social contact, singing, music, all of these elicit our endorphins. And these endorphins make us feel better. They make us feel more connected with other people. They help resolve emotional problems. And they may have some very significant feed-forward effects upon our immunological system. So to me, when we begin to understand spiritual healing, sure, accuse me of reducing it to these things, but I'm not saying that those are the only mechanisms. But I'm saying these are the necessary mechanisms. And I would expand that to include the alterations of consciousness. What happens in the brain when we enter into an altered state of consciousness really is, moving into the relaxation response, counteracting the stress responses, entering into contact with our own unconscious, engaging at a deeper level and understanding of our own emotional issues. So to me, this is another part of the package of what has spiritual healing always been. And I think it was, inevitable that it was attributed to human beings or human-like beings, the spirits, because of the way our brain is structured, and because one of the things that elicits placebo effect and hypnotic effect are powerful protective others. Physicians that are seen as being powerful, protective, and competent have placebo effects several times higher than those that don't have those qualities.
Mm-hmm.
But even what doctors are doing is in large part based upon a kind of placebo effect. And so in this sense, I think we have to pay attention to those dynamics as part of understanding what was spiritual healing always along the way.
And you note many of those ritual dancing, drumming, chanting, herbs, belief. We have some of those today. I think you mentioned in your book, of course, the lab coat is a signal of authority, and it's a persona based image, and we project onto that, and that has power. I think that's really important to note that it's almost an egoic move here to presume that because I can't control causality and have a one-to-one correspondence between what I do and the effect, I just kick it out with this, under this heading of placebo effect, because that violates the materialistic assumptions of being able to observe, measure, and produce a given result, which is just an interesting phenomena that we don't even look at it or value it. It's just like, oh yeah, placebo effect. That's
Well, I
pretty
think
radical.
it's because people fundamentally misunderstand the placebo effect. Even physicians fundamentally misunderstand the placebo effect.
Mm-hmm.
They think that it's not real. It is real, but it's a symbolically mediated physiological response.
Well, what is made unreal is the value or the nature of the symbol in this system.
Not recognized as being symbolic.
Yeah. Radical. Okay, so I'm aware of our time, and I want to be sure we have plenty of runway to close out. The one thing that I also wanted to get into here, and I want to find my notes.
Well, I'll see one thing here. I'll talk to you if you go. You ask about the value of cross-cultural studies.
Yes.
Which has been an important tool that I've used to come to a number of understandings about the nature of shamanism. And so, the idea here is that, if we try to understand, for instance, what is shamanism from the perspective of any one culture, today we have a horrible problem that everybody thinks, that their grandmother's a shaman, that, their drug dealer's a shaman, and that the crazy lady down the street's a shaman too,
Mm-hmm.
So my approach was trying to understand whether or not there really was a cross-cultural phenomena to start with. And so my approach, going back to my dissertation, that was the subject of a book called Shamans, Priests, and Witches, that I used the cross-cultural sample, 186 societies that span, the known ethnographic universe, as you mentioned, going all the way back to the Babylonians and what we know about them and their healing practices, through mid-20th century. And it's a sample that has a lot of other data already coded for it. So I used a subsample of that to code for the characteristics of the healers, the religious practitioners more broadly. I mean, I decided I couldn't even just try to limit it to healers. I was interested in what religious practitioners were like. And so created a variable set, literally over 100 variables, and used that to try to determine whether or not there were cross-cultural similarities in religious practices. And the interesting thing here is that this kind of flies in the face of long-standing, social science perspectives that have considered religion just to be an arbitrary set of beliefs. Mm-hmm. Whatever you want to believe is religion. Everybody has their own religion. Religion is, individually, culturally unique, set of beliefs. Well, what my cross-cultural approach was able to show is that there are very substantial cross-cultural patterns in the way that religious practitioners are selected and trained, their powers, what they heal, how they engage in divination, their social relations, a whole range of features that are very similar across cultures. They're not identical across cultures. In fact, if we include the whole group of practitioners, there are very dramatic differences between different kinds of practitioners. There are priests, and priests are not like shamans. There are mediums, and mediums are not like shamans. So what my cross-cultural research was able to show were that there was this common pattern of spiritual healing practice found in hunter-gatherer societies. This is what has driven the intuition about shamanism being a cultural universal. But the pattern of behavior that exists in hunter-gathering societies pretty quickly dissipates in agricultural societies, particularly when they get political hierarchies. In fact, I would make the argument based upon converging evidence is that the only thing that was left of shamanism for Western culture were the people that were persecuted as witches. And even those weren't all shamans, but that's another dynamic that emerges. Priestly-like organizations emerge under agriculture. They're inherited positions. They depend upon the ancestors. They engage in agricultural rituals. They provide for purifications and blessings and cleansings. And they have a lot of social power. They run the judiciary. They're in charge of the government. And they decide who's a witch and needs to be killed. So there's a whole dynamic of religious practice that I've recently gone back and done some reanalysis and, sort of recontextualize what I did in Shamans, Priests, and Witches. It's called a biogenetic and ethnological model of religion and ritual. But the idea here is that we can make a lot of well-grounded inferences about the nature of religious practices in the past using models that are derived from cross-cultural research. And they show us that religion is not arbitrary, but it has a variety of different organizational principles, one related to altered states of consciousness and endogenous healing processes, a second related to the power of ancestor systems and their control of agricultural productivity and the government. And then there's this sector of the witches that really are shamanistic healers that are being persecuted by priests and healers because they're a competing ideology and a competing set of practices and a competing set of loyalties.
Yeah.
And so, I think that it's kind of interesting if you look at, the word witch and then look at its etymology, the origin of it from a linguistic point of view. There's nothing horrible, evil, destructive about the roots of witch and wick, manifested in Wicca. It has to do with clan-based organization. It has to do with images and imitation. It has to do with the power of the wind and wine. It has a totally different set of meanings that have nothing at all to do with what is projected as witchcraft. Why? Because what we consider to be witchcraft had origins in something very different.
Thank you for that. So what is your critique of what you're seeing in shamanism today? What you mentioned it earlier that, a woman down the street, everybody's a shaman.
Well, I'll just briefly summarize what I found to be the features that were characteristic of shamans and foraging societies, other religious practitioners of foraging societies that I label as shamans. And they were selected on the basis of illness and trauma, spirit visitations, dreams. They underwent a vigorous period of training, often alone in the wilderness, prolonged periods of fasting, often taking emetics and psychoactive substances. They encountered spirit beings that came first to kill them, to dismember them, to eat them. And then normally these spirit animals put the initiate back together, remembered him, reformed him. These were typically males, although females were allowed. They weren't allowed to practice during childbearing years, but before and after they were. These practitioners were thought to get their powers from animals, that they incorporated animal powers, that they were thought to be able to turn into animals. This typically happened during an out-of-body experience in which they were thought to leave their body and go to other worlds, other planes of the worlds, or other areas in this world, often in animal form. They were thought to heal illnesses related to soul loss. The person's soul had left their body, they recover the lost soul. Also, illnesses due to sorcery, injury caused by other shamans. And shamans were uniformly in foraging societies thought to be able to cause illness and death to other people. So, when people say today, oh, I'm a shaman, I say, oh, well, how many people have you killed? Well, I don't kill people, I'm a shaman. Well, no, that's what shamans did in pre-modern societies. They were believed to kill people. And so to me, if you look at the dynamics of what were the healing practitioners of foraging societies, it just doesn't correspond to what you find today. Even if you go look at, what are ayahuasca shamans? I mean, these people have very few of the features related to the foraging shamans. So to me, the terms become almost useless because it's grossly overextended.
Mm-hmm.
And its overextension has to do with applying it basically to anybody who does a ritual or enters an altered states of conscious or heals. And I think if the term is going to be useful, it needs to be differentiated. For instance, many people today will apply the term shaman to what I would call, on my empirical analysis, a medium. There's someone who is possessed. Shamans weren't possessed. Taken over by a superior spirit, a male often, a male deity takes over them. Could be a female, but it's a powerful other person. They're thought to go through tremors and convulsions, and they have amnesia. They're normally low social status people in their group, and their healing is of, giving blessings, giving purification, or exorcism. And we could just like this doesn't dovetail and hardly anything at all with what were shamans. Now, I've tried to provide a conceptual framework to sort of gloss over those differences and extract the commonalities. And this came out of my formal data research. It's universal that we find healers who use altered states of consciousness in ritual settings to interact with spirits for healing and divination. So every culture has that kind of practice. I would say this is one of the biogenetic origins of religion. It has to do with the intrinsic properties of the brain that allow for altered states of consciousness to produce integrative healing states, and to use ritual to enhance placebo effects, hypnotic effects, expectancy effects, social bonding, and to use things such as singing and dancing in group agglomeration to elicit the endogenous opioid system. Mm-hmm. And that these kinds of experiences are why ritual healing is a human universal. So I would call shamanistic healers people who use altered states with rituals to heal with spirit interventions. But, that's much more than what I would want to call shamans. But we can call them shamanistic healers if we want to accept that shamanism was the original manifestation and origin of these kinds of practices.
You mentioned something about a male spirit. Oftentimes today, what I've heard just from talking to folks is that with ayahuasca, for example, or DMT, of course, that there's a feminine energy or goddess or some kind of fairy or something that people encounter. Do you notice any trends in the quality or the content of the visions that people have throughout history?
Well, I mean, I think it would be easy to say, in shamanic societies, it was the animals that showed up. It was animal power. But if you're a forager, you're wandering, from place to place every day. I mean, the animals are the most important elements of the environment. Not just because you eat some and some eat you, but because animals are warning systems. Animals are communication systems. Animals respond to other animals or other groups of people. So, shamans paid attention to animals. Animals were the visions. Animals were what were thought to kill the shamans. Animals were the source of shamans' powers. Animals were the vehicle through which shamans could travel. So clearly early on, animals were very prominent in visions. Now, when you go to, the kind of ecstatic religious traditions of the Greeks, other Middle Eastern cultures, this whole, range of mystical and mystery schools, well, all of a sudden the relationships are different. The shaman was traveling to the lower worlds to encounter the animal powers. Now the mystical initiate travels to the celestial realms, and they encounter angels and they encounter archangels and they encounter, God or other powerful, people. And the whole, issue is more one about, purifying and uniting oneself with deity rather than, uniting oneself with an animal. So clearly, the accounts of visionary experiences that you find in literature change across time. You get to mediumship. I mean, even the visionary capacity seems to be subordinated to a emphasis upon the spoken word, the word of the gods. And so it's, words now rather than visions.
Mm-hmm. Well, just in service to close out, a couple questions. When was the last time and under what circumstances did you have your mind blown?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say that, the most significant ayahuasca experience I had was my first ritual ayahuasca experience. And it occurred in Missouri, of all places, at a friend of mine's house who was a psychotherapist. And she had an American who had been trained in the ayahuasca traditions of Peru, as the ritualist. And in the context of that ceremony, I went through a lot of different kinds of, efforts to define what my intention and purpose was going to be. And in the very end, I just decided to talk to the ayahuasca in Spanish and tell it just to show me whatever it was I needed to know. And for better or for worse, the revelations I got that night sent me on my path to Brazil eventually. Perhaps the most interesting and quirky part of it all was, I'd never been to Brazil at that time. But while I was in that ceremony, in that session, someone who I'd only met once sent me an invitation to be his invited guest to participate in an ayahuasca retreat down in Brazil. I mean, he's literally writing this while I'm having this vision of apocalyptic ends to the earth and the need to figure out where my path forward is. So the fact that he was basically inviting me to go to Brazil and participate in ayahuasca sessions while I'm basically doing my first ayahuasca ritual, to me, I was like, man, how does the world come together that way?
Yeah, I mean, the synchronicities are kind of part of that unseen mystery. The other piece is, you kind of mentioned it earlier, but what are your concerns about what are happening with psychedelics, or what's happening with the psychedelic landscape right now? What's your word of caution?
Well, I guess my first thing would be is that, everybody's talking about the psychedelic renaissance, but most of these substances are still Schedule 1 and you can't even get them for research purposes. So, it's sort of like, I don't think we really got to the renaissance yet. We're still, I mean, things are looking up, but we're still in the dark ages of psychedelic research. Simple fact. The other thing is that, the emerging, trends of the commercialization, and, the models now are that, well, this is, a break even, prospect if people are paying $5,000 for a weekend psychedelic session with medical supervision. I mean, that leaves it, beyond the availability of most people. And then just the whole trend towards medicalization. I mean, that somehow we're going to need a doctor to give us a prescription to use this stuff. I mean, this is like, I think that, psychedelics should be used with responsible supervision, particularly for first-time users, for people with taking, super heroic doses, for people with, various, medical or psychological conditions. Yeah, I think it's important that they have supervision, at least initially. But, we've been using these things probably for 5 million years. It's not like we need to have another, double blind study to be sure that somehow, we can use these things without, easily killing ourselves. I mean, anybody that's killed themselves with psychedelics has probably either fallen asleep out in the forest at night and went into hypothermia, or they tried to fly off the top of a building. And if we can try to avoid those two, scenarios, I think psychedelics ought to be as easy to get as, at least medicinal marijuana, if not just totally decriminalized. But at the same time, I don't think that, that pre-adolescents ought to be using these things. And I think that adolescents, probably ought to be introduced to them in well-structured settings. I do not want to downplay the seriousness of psychedelic-related problems. I mean, I've had people recently just coming to me and just like, you can't believe how bad, my life is now since I've done psychedelics. The goblins don't go away. The DMT elves are always there. There's somebody out to get me. I can't make the visions go away. So yeah, we need some kind of orientation for people to use these substances. We need some kind of structured setting. But I don't think that making doctors in charge of this is going to really, help us move forward in any kind of substantial way as a spiritual practice. Now, if you want to make doctors in charge of, treating Alzheimer's patients or people with treatment-resistant depression, great. Give the doctors the right to do that. But don't take away our right to our own religious freedoms. I think we ought to consider the right to use psilocybin as an inherent religious right. We know that it induces spiritual experiences and mystical experiences. We know that humans around the world have used it for tens of thousands of years, if not for millions of years. And this is a human birthright. And I think that's how it ought to be considered, and it ought to be protected as such.
Well, and then thank you. And then in closing, are there any of those questions that you see that we didn't get to that you'd like to answer, or any other threads that are left hanging that we need to close up tie up before we finish?
Well, I don't know if there's any threads that we really need to tie together here. And maybe I'll just, sort of make it a sort of summary notion that, shamanism is practiced in pre-modern societies with a remarkably similar pattern around the world. And so one of the points I didn't make about cross-cultural research is that it helps us identify human universals. When we identify human universals, then we have likely identified some kind of biologically based phenomena. I think we ought to see shamanism as an evolved social psychology, an evolved structure of our brains and minds that was in part shaped by the ability to facilitate the use of these substances for constructive purposes. That in essence, shamanism evolved as a communal healing practice, but we individually also evolved to be able to take advantage of that kind of communal psychedelic inspired healing practice. And so we need to really, in going forward, I think, try to recover a good understanding of just what it was that shamanism involved in this pre-modern context, how rituals were performed, what kind of activities were engaged in, and ultimately what kind of illnesses were treated. And in this sense, I think that we can see a better path forward to how it is that medical as well as non-medical use of psychedelics might optimize what's called set and setting. I published an article a year or two ago called The Evolved Psychology of Set and Setting. I'm trying to turn this whole notion of set and setting on its head. Normally, set and setting is thought to be individual, personal kinds of preferences. But what we have to understand is that when it comes to psychedelics, we have an innate set and setting, and it's not going to soccer games or watching wrestling matches.
Right.
It's with a community of people at nighttime, using music, using dance, using drama, using sound as a healing envelope. And so I've tried to outline these ideas. I have another article, I think, shamanic guidelines for psychedelic medicine. I've tried to synthesize what it is that we know about how psychedelics and how shamanic healing in general was done. And I think that this provides us with a way to go forward using the wisdom of ancestral traditions to better shape our healing practices today.
And where would you like people to find you? You can look below, of course. I'll post all the links on our on the show notes, but would you direct people to your site?
Well, I have my website, michaelwinkelman.com, but every time I've tried to contract someone to upgrade it, they take the money and leave. People want to get my articles. Go to researchgate.net. If you've got an academic address, you can easily get an account there. And I probably have 150 articles there, ranging from shamanism to the evolution of religion to psychedelics to psychedelic healing, that I've got out there available to people. So best place to get my stuff for free all in one place is there at researchgate.net.
That's a good recommendation. Thank you, Michael Winkelman. I will have all of those links available. I have thoroughly enjoyed connecting with you and reading your work, and I will continue to do so and reference it for many years to come. I just am so thankful of this muse that you started following years ago and looking at cross-cultural analysis. I'm certainly standing on your shoulders, so to speak. So thank you very much for what you do.
Great. Pleasure, John. I'm glad to help share word with people there. I think we need to understand this part of our innate nature and our perhaps inalienable religious and spiritual rights.
Well said.
Control.